Hi there! I'm coming to you live from my kitchen, sitting atop my kitchen sink. Going to be talking to you today about generational giving, how each generation has given towards charity organizations, the difference between each generation, how they grew up and the times they grew up historically. And I'm going to focus a little bit solely on the baby boomer generation. So let's begin with the great generation, or the greatest generation, as some people call it. These folks were born typically between 1901 and 1924. They came of age during the Great Depression and during World War II. After the World War II, they came home, they moved out to the suburbs, they started families, they worked very hard, and they landed on the moon. After them was the silent generation. The silent generation was born between 1925 and 1944. This is when my parents were born. They enjoyed a good childhood. They they worked hard. They were teenagers during the 1950s, which was a joyous, happy-go-lucky time for our nation culturally. As adults, they worked hard at both blue and white-collar jobs, and they really didn't have much to say. They loved their country, they loved one another, and they worked hard. They're a silent generation. They're sandwiched between the greatest generation and, of course, the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers, they are called the baby boomer generation because they were born, their parents were part of the great generation. So again, as I just mentioned, they came home from the war, moved out to the suburbs, and started families. 77 million children were born in the years following World War II. It's a huge, huge number. So, but the baby boomer generation, they're known as rebel rousers. They went against the traditional vibe of American cultures. You have, as they came of age during the late 1960s and 70s, you have Woodstock, you have the cultural rejection of traditional American values, a sexual revolution. You've got folks that want to do their own thing. They want to be heard. They want their voices heard. They want things done their way. They're loud and they're proud. They're the baby boomers. After them became Generation X. And Generation X, their birth years are typically between the late 1960s and the early 1980s. Their childhood was marked by a lot of historical and political events that happened. You've got Watergate, you've got the end of the Vietnam War, you've got the end of the Vietnam War, you've got the fall of the Berlin Wall, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. That's what shaped and formed the childhood of Generation X. Personally speaking, I'll never forget the day that the Challenger exploded in January of 1986. I was in elementary school, and they came into our classroom and told us what happened. Very shocking moment for all of us, a moment that I remember marked my childhood in terms of historical events happening in our country. As Generation X got a little older, they were termed as slackers and unmotivated. I found it a little bit funny because Generation X, their numbers in terms of education and volunteerism far exceeds those of their predecessors when they were in their 30s and 40s. Interesting. After Generation X comes the millennial generation, and their birth dates are still up for interpretation in terms of really where it begins and where it ends. Is Generation Millennium still being born now? Some folks say yes, some folks say they aren't being born. They started being born in the their mid-80s or so. Then they have a couple subdivisions beyond. You have Generation Y, you have Generation Z. You have, and then there's a whole other subgroup of kids that were between the ages of 10 and 20 when 9/11 hit. So you have a bunch of different subgroups, but you can characterize them all as as millennium generation. But I think as history moves on, we'll be able to redefine and come up with a little more firm identity of where generation millennium or millennium generation makes their mark. Typically, the millennium generation is connected. They've got their smartphones, they've got their internet, they've got instant communication, and those are the trends that we're seeing with generation millennium. Okay, now that I've given an idea of where each generation falls out in terms of when they were born and what they experienced growing up and into adulthood, I want to talk a little bit about how they are giving to charitable organizations. Typically speaking, the older generations, that would be the Great and the Silent generation, they tend to give more towards religious organizations, whereas the younger three generations, the baby boomers, Generation X, and the millennium generation, they tend to give more towards secular organizations, secular charities. A common weave that I saw between all these generations is that they all have a desire to make the world a better place, and they also want to give towards those who have less and that are struggling. And so I want to talk a little bit specifically about the baby boomer generation. They give the most out of all generations, as an estimated $47 billion annually. Of course, they give the most. It's more kind of a numbers game. I mean, again, as I said earlier, 77 million babies were born in that post-World War II generation. So it's just typically a numbers game. The more people that are in that age bracket are going to give more. But I think the more underlying question, though, beyond that is, yeah, they're giving more as a whole, but person to person specifically, are they giving more than the other generations? And recent research has shown that they are not, actually. And some contributing factors that might play into that reason would be, well, let's look at what's happened to us culturally over the last 50 or so years. We have an uprising in the number of divorces, and second families is climbing. Of course, as we all know, more than 50% of marriages fail these days, and that's going to put a tight strain on the finances there. If with having to compensate for divorce and second family, there making money's tight. And then I think more recently with our economic recession that we've had, from 2007 or so to around 2010, that has made people have to tighten up their budgets as well, and they're less likely to give when they have more expenses that they have to pay out because of certain situations. The general rule of thumb is that the more education people have, the more likely they are to give towards charitable organizations. This, however, has not been true with baby boomers. Perhaps their high education levels have made them more analytical, more skeptical of where their money is going towards and what exactly they're supporting. This contributing factor here has made it tough for some organizations to connect and to establish relationships with the baby boomer generation. And those that have been successful in doing that are the organizations that support things that tug at the heart of the baby boomers. You think about the 60s, you think about the global world we live in, the environment, civil rights groups. These are the groups that the baby boomers are giving towards, because, again, they want to make the world a much better place. And done.